In the dry Tarim Basin of China's far west region, near the border of Kyrgyzstan, archaeologists have uncovered a series of Bronze Age tombs containing naturally mummified bodies with Caucasian features. Tall individuals with red or blonde hair, high-bridged noses, and deep-set eyes. These Tarim Basin mummies, some as old as 4,000 years, were so well preserved by the desert's arid climate that their eyelashes and hair are still intact. They were buried in elaborate cemeteries that were nothing like traditional Chinese tombs. In fact, early visitors described the scene as if Celts or Vikings had been mysteriously transported into the middle of the Chinese desert, referring to the mummy's European appearance, plaid textiles, and even cone-shaped so-called witches' hats that were found atop some of the burials. And so let's explore the discovery and significance behind these mysterious mummies, even the ancient pyramids that they've been linked to, blending archaeology, genetics, and history to illuminate this important lost chapter of Eurasia's past. The existence of ancient mummies in the Taklamakan Desert first were discovered in the early 20th century. Pioneering explorers like Sven Hedin, Albert von Lecoq, and Sir Aurel Stein reported finding desiccated human remains during their Silk Road expeditions. But systematic study only began decades later. In 1979, Chinese archaeologists excavating at Gumongo, near the dried-up Lop Nur Lake, uncovered 42 ancient graves. Some of the earliest mummies dated around 2135 to 1939 BCE. And not long after, in 1980, a film crew working on a Silk Road documentary stumbled upon a remarkably preserved female mummy near Lulan, an ancient oasis city. Dubbed the Beauty of Lulan, this woman of around 1800 BCE was found swaddled in a woolen cloak, wearing a fur hat and leather boots. Her body had lain in a salt-rich desert for 3,800 years, yet looked uncannily lifelike, down to her long auburn hair and even delicate eyelashes. Dozens more mummies soon emerged as Chinese teams excavated along the edges of the Taklamakan Desert, and most were found in the Tarim Basin, in the modern Xinjiang region, at oasis cemeteries from Turpan in the east to Khotan in the southwest. Among the most famous finds is Charchan Man, a 6-foot, red-haired male buried around 1000 BCE, wearing a tartan-patterned wool tunic and plaid leggings. He was interred with 2 women, possibly his wives, and an infant son. The baby, wrapped in burgundy wool and wearing a blue felt cap, was laid to rest with stones covering his eyes, in a timeless funerary ritual. Farther east, near Turpan, the witches of Subeshi, from around the 4th to 3rd century BCE, were found with tall black conical hats, which are over 2 feet long, a style eerily evocative of later witch costumes, but it's actually typical headgear of the Saka Scythian nomads. By the early 1990s, hundreds of similar mummies had been uncovered and displayed in the regional museum in Urumqi, capital of Xinjiang. Yet one of the most significant sites had been lost to history and only recently rediscovered. In 1934, Swedish explorer Folke Bergum surveyed a remote graveyard called xiaohe, or Small River, which was located deep in the desert. He reported unusual boat-shaped coffins, but this location was lost for decades. In 2000, a team from the Xinjiang Institute of Cultural Relics used satellite data and local guides to relocate xiaohe, and excavations from 2002 onward revealed an enormous burial complex, known as Ordex Necropolis, containing around 330 tombs dating from 2000 to 1450 BCE. The dead were placed in wooden coffins carved like boats, sealed with cowhide, and topped with long wooden stakes or oars thrust vertically into the sand. One spectacular mummy here was the Beauty of xiaohe, a young woman adorned in a tall felt hat and finely woven wool cloak, interred with grave goods like a wooden comb, grain basket, and even a food tray. When unearthed, she appeared lifelike, like she was smiling softly in her sleep. Why were these people buried in boats in the middle of a desert? What explains their Western appearance, and what role did they play in early Eurasian history? These questions launched a flurry of research over the last 3 decades, research that would challenge assumptions about East-West contacts in antiquity. American archaeologist Victor Mayer, who first saw the mummies in 1988, admits he initially thought they were an elaborate hoax because they looked, quote, too good to be true, with fair skin and European facial features. But once convinced of their authenticity, Mayer helped organize international investigations in the 1990s, including early attempts at DNA analysis. The quest to understand the Tarim mummies has since involved an array of disciplines, from textile analysis and linguistics to advanced genomic sequencing, revealing a culture at the crossroads of the ancient world. Red hair is one of the rarest natural colors in the world and has a fascinating genetic and evolutionary origin. Its appearance is primarily linked to mutations in a gene called MC1R, melanocortin 1 receptor, which plays a key role in the production of melanin, the pigment that determines hair, skin, and eye color. In people with 2 mutated copies of this gene, one from each parent, the body produces more pheomelanin, a reddish-yellow pigment, and less eumelanin, a dark brown-black pigment, resulting in red hair, fair skin, and a higher likelihood of freckling. And interestingly, one variant of the MC1R gene associated with red hair has also been found in Neanderthal DNA, suggesting that the mutation may be quite old and existed in both archaic and modern human populations. Ancient DNA evidence indicates that some European hunter-gatherers as far back as 10,000 to 8,000 years ago carried MC1R variants that would produce red or auburn hair. Today it's most commonly associated with people of northwestern European descent, especially in the British Isles. The highest frequencies are found in Scotland, around 13 to 14%, Ireland, where it's 10 to 12%, and Wales and parts of England have about 6 to 10%. It also appears in smaller proportions throughout Scandinavia and continental Europe, and these high rates are thought to be the result of both genetic isolation and natural selection in environments with low ultraviolet radiation. Several theories have been proposed to explain why red hair evolved. The most widely accepted is the vitamin D hypothesis, which suggests that people with fair skin and red hair could synthesize more vitamin D in low sunlight climates, providing a survival advantage in northern latitudes. Another theory points to sexual selection, the idea that rare traits like red hair may have been considered attractive and thus more likely to be passed on. A third explanation involves genetic drift, which means the red hair trait may have spread simply by chance in small, isolated populations without offering a major evolutionary advantage. It's just random. And while it is northwestern Europe we mostly think of today, red hair is not confined to Europe. It appears, though at much lower frequencies, in parts of the Middle East and Central Asia, and this may be due to ancient indo-European migrations. For example, the Tocharians and Scythians were known to have Western Eurasian ancestry. In South and Central Asia, rare cases of red hair can be found among groups like the Pashtuns, Kalash, and some Jewish populations, but this is all likely due to historic gene flow from indo-Europeans or steppe populations. And the first clue in solving this mystery is to notice that the roots of red hair may go back to Ice Age Eurasia, and maybe even Neanderthals, meaning that where we see it most popular today, it doesn't mean that's where this originated from thousands of years ago. But going back to the Tarim Basin site, we can see that these mummies provide an incredible time capsule of Bronze Age life on the fringes of ancient China. Unlike Egyptian mummies, these bodies were naturally desiccated, mummified not by deliberate embalming, but by the desert's extreme dryness, saline soil, and sub-zero winters that halted decay. The preservation is so superb that archaeologists could recover details as fine as tattoos, textiles, and even food remains in the burials. It did an even better job at natural preservation than those most ancient of Egyptian mummies that actually were desiccated in the sand, the process that came before the whole industry of mummification that became synonymous with Egypt. But one fascinating aspect of these in the Tarim Basin is the clothing and fabric technology of this culture. The Tarim people were skilled wool weavers, producing twill and plaid textiles on par with contemporary weaving in Bronze Age Europe. Like how Charcharman's plaid twill leggings bear an uncanny resemblance to Celtic tartans of the Iron Age. Textile expert Elizabeth Wayland Barber noted that the twill weave and plaid pattern are virtually identical to fabric scraps from the Hallstatt-era salt mines in Austria of around 1200 BCE. Making it, quote, the easternmost known example. This suggests either a common origin or an astonishing transmission of textile knowledge across Eurasia in prehistory. Equally sophisticated is a red wool robe worn by Charchanman's wife. The weave and rich burgundy dye were so advanced that, as Mayer put it, quote, it is hard to imagine how their weaving technology could have achieved such an advanced stage by that time. The burial goods show a hybrid of pastoral and agricultural lifestyles. In the graves, archaeologists found wheat, barley, and millet grains, as well as animal bones and dairy products. The inclusion of wheat and barley, crops originally domesticated in the Near East, shows that these Western foods had reached Xinjiang by 2000 BCE. One burial contained small cakes of ancient kefir cheese, placed on the corpse's neck and chest. Recent DNA tests confirmed this white substance as the world's oldest known cheese, from about 3,600 years ago, made from fermented cow and goat milk. The Tarim people were evidently adept dairy pastoralists. Milk proteins have been detected in the dental calculus or the plaque of the mummies, showing they consumed yogurt or cheese regularly. They kept cattle, sheep, and goats, and grew millet and wheat, creating a mixed agro-pastoral economy at the desert's edge. As Christina Warrener, a senior author of the study, put it, these folks were, quote, remarkably culturally cosmopolitan, building their cuisine around wheat and dairy from West Asia, millet from East Asia, and medicinal plants like ephedra from Central Asia, even as they remained geographically isolated. I can't not mention that ephedra is believed to be the halma, the indo-iranian or Aryan version of what the people of India called soma, a plant deeply connected to religious ritual in each of their practices. From Sanatana Dharma, or what most people call Hinduism in India, or the ephedra or halma in this pre-Zoroastrian and into Zoroastrian culture throughout Iran. So from wheat and dairy advancements all the way over in Anatolia and along the Caspian Sea, northern Iran region, you can see that it really is pulling from so many different cultures. The boat-based coffins found at the Xiaohe cemetery in the Tarim Basin are among the most visually and symbolically striking burial practices in the ancient world. Carved from whole tree trunks and carefully arranged to resemble boats, these coffins were buried upright in the sand, with the pointed prow often aligned in a specific direction, and the deceased laid to rest inside as if setting off on a journey. Scholars widely interpret this design as a metaphor for a spiritual journey into the afterlife, echoing a concept found in many ancient cultures across Eurasia and beyond, seeing that death was not the end but a passage from one world to another, and requiring a vessel to safely travel there. This symbolic use of boats and funerary rites is deeply rooted in human tradition. In ancient Egypt, solar boats were buried near royal tombs to carry pharaohs across the sky with the sun god Ra. The Norse Vikings famously burned their dead in ships or boat-shaped graves, equipping them with weapons and supplies for the afterlife. Even in Bronze Age Europe, from the British Isles to the Carpathian Basin, archaeologists have discovered burials containing miniature boats or grave goods arranged in a way that all suggests this seafaring motif. In all these traditions, the boat represents a powerful image. It's the means by which the soul crosses a cosmic boundary, whether a river, a sea, or the sky itself, and they can use this to enter the realm of ancestors or gods. What makes the xiaohe coffins even more fascinating is that they appear in a region that is now one of the most arid deserts on Earth, far from any navigable body of water. Geological studies suggest that the desertification of the Tarim Basin began during the late Miocene epoch, around 5 million years ago. This aridification intensified due to tectonic activity, notably the uplift of the surrounding mountain ranges, which altered atmospheric circulation patterns and reduced moisture influx into the basin. Despite these long-term trends, the region has undergone periods of climatic fluctuation. During the early to mid-Holocene epoch, about 8,000 to 4,000 years ago, the Tarim Basin did experience a relatively warmer and more humid climate. This phase is often referred to as the Holocene climactic optimum, and it allowed for the development of oases, and it supported human habitation, agriculture, and the establishments of sites like the Xiaohe Cemetery. But from approximately 2,900 to 900 years ago, this region transitioned to a warmer and drier climate, leading to the expansion of desert conditions that characterize the area today. These environmental changes influenced the settlement patterns, with communities adapting to the increasingly arid landscape or relocating to more hospitable areas. So at the time of burial, this was a vast desert, though it may be a holdover from a time or location where there was water. And this suggests that the boat motif was not a practical reference anymore, but a deeply symbolic and spiritual one, possibly inherited from cultural exchanges with distant groups or stemming from an older, widely shared mythological framework. Some scholars have proposed that the Xiaohe people believed in a celestial river or underworld sea that the dead had to traverse, and that the vertical oars or posts planted beside the coffins may have served as markers or guides for this otherworldly passage. The presence of grave goods like food offerings, wooden bowls, and even clothing alongside the deceased all reinforce the idea that this was a journey equipped with all the necessities, very similar to the beliefs in ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Eurasian steppe in general. That just as you were a body with a spirit, the physical forms of these things, from the boat to the food to the clothes, the sort of spirit of those objects would go along with your spirit, as everything in that tomb was now connected, leaving behind its physical body, and were now embarking together on their spiritual journey. At Gumugo, some burials featured stick figures or posts carved in human shape, and at least one body had a masked face, suggesting ritualistic elements, and early excavators reported 5 severed heads placed on stakes at that site, possibly as ancestral effigies or sacrifices. In Subeshi, one male mummy even showed signs of an ancient surgical operation in the form of a stitched incision on his abdomen closed with horsehair sutures. Thanks to the desert's preservation powers, several mummies still bear visible tattoos on their skin. These tattoos are among the oldest in East Asia and seem to have had symbolic significance. A female mummy dating between 1000 and 600 BCE was found with intricate tattoo patterns, small moons on her eyelids, ovals on her forehead, and a decorative scroll motif running along her left hand and fingers. These designs may have signified her status or served spiritual purposes, and a similar tattooing practice was common among the Scythian horsemen of the Altai Mountains to the north, all around this same time, and suggests a shared steppe artistic tradition. All these clues, European-style textiles, mixed agriculture, dairy products, and shamanistic tattoos, paint a picture of an eclectic frontier society. The Tarim Basin communities were geographically in Asia, but culturally connected far and wide. They lived in oases along river deltas fringing the Taklamakan, in what was then a milder climate of grassy plains and marshes. There is evidence of wheeled vehicles. They used wooden wagon wheels and even had small bronze objects, implying mobility and trade. And so they were innovators and adapters, harnessing technologies from neighboring civilizations while also maintaining distinctive local traditions. But what do the genes say? When these mummies first came to international attention, their European-like looks led to much speculation about their origins. Early hypotheses argued that they were indo-European migrants, perhaps proto-Tocharians, who had journeyed eastward from the steppe or even Europe. Some scholars pointed to the Afanasyevo culture of around 3500 to 2500 BCE as a likely source coming from southern Siberia, since Afanasyevo people were an early offshoot of the Yamnaya steppe nomads and were known to have Caucasoid features and cattle-herding economies. This theory gained traction because Afanasyevo artifacts and burial styles seemed to resemble those of the Tarim mummies. An alternative theory suggests that they came via the Bactria-Margania archaeological complex, or BMAC, of Central Asia, the Oxus civilization, or maybe even the Indus Valley. In other words, that West Asian farmers, or Harappans, moved north and east into Xinjiang. For years, debates would just hang on how everything looked. Physical anthropology produced mixed signals. One early craniometric analysis in the year 2000 identified the Gomungo skulls of about 2000 BCE as Proto-Europoid, with close affinities to Bronze Age Siberians and Kazakhs. But a revised study in 2003 found those same skulls didn't neatly match any known population, not BMAC urbanites. Instead, they formed their own cluster, distinct from Europeans or East Asians. This hinted at that Tarim's original inhabitants might have been an indigenous population, not directly descended from one of these migrant groups. And finally, just a few years ago, nearly 100 years after the discovery, advanced ancient DNA sequencing has cracked the case, and the results were surprising to everyone. In 2021, an international research team extracted and analyzed genome-wide DNA from 13 of the oldest Tarim Basin mummies, those from 2100 to 1700 BCE, and 5 early individuals from the neighboring Zungarian Basin, from around 3000 to 2800 BCE. The findings, published in Nature, overturned the old migration hypotheses. The Zungarian samples from North Xinjiang did indeed carry genes from the Afanasyevo/Yamnaya pastoralists, confirming that steppe nomads had reached the fringes of Xinjiang by 3000 BCE. But the Tarim Basin mummies were a different story. Their DNA showed no trace of Afanasyevo or any other recently arrived group. Instead, the Tarim people turned out to be direct descendants of a very ancient lineage known as the Ancient North Eurasians. ANE were Ice Age hunter-gatherers who populated Siberia and Central Asia over 10,000 years earlier, a population that has largely vanished today, surviving only in small genetic fractions in modern Siberians and Native Americans. The genomes of the Tarim mummies were almost 100% ANE, making them a, quote, previously unknown genetic isolate that had undergone millennia of separation and inbreeding in Central Asia. One geneticist marveled, quote, archaeogeneticists have long searched for Holocene ANE populations. We have found one in the most unexpected place. To put it in more plain terms, the first Bronze Age people of the Tarim Basin were not recent newcomers at all. They were indigenous to Inner Asia, the descendants of a Pleistocene Ice Age tribe that somehow survived in a pocket of Xinjiang until the Bronze Age. How they endured and where they were before 2000 BCE remains a bit of a mystery, but their genetic profile is so unmixed that it suggests that they were long isolated, perhaps in some remote Central Asian refuge, until climate or contacts allowed them to move into the Tarim oases. This discovery upends the old assumption that all technological advances in Xinjiang must have come with migrants. Instead, it appears that this local ANE-derived group adopted farming and livestock by borrowing ideas from neighbors, likely from the Afanasyevo and others, rather than by large-scale intermarriage. We know that they have milk peptides by species that were domesticated and not in their area. Originally, it all comes from the Anatolia region between the Black Sea and Caspian, and so they learned dairying techniques from steppe cultures by cultural transfer without gene transfer. There was no substantial gene flow. And so while the Tarim pioneers were genetically isolated, they did not stay culturally isolated. By the late Bronze and Iron Age from 1500 to 500 BCE, new waves of people did enter the Tarim Basin. DNA and physical remains show a mixing of ancestries in later cemeteries. Some mummies have obvious East Asian, Siberian, or Han Chinese traits, while others have Andronovo steppe ancestry, which is related to indo-iranian Scythians, and also BMAC ancestry from Central Asia. One recent large-scale study of ancient genomes in Xinjiang, which pulled from 201 specimens across the region, found that by the Ice Age, the population had become a genetic mosaic of at least 4 major lineages. The original Tarim group, plus influxes from the Eurasian steppe, both west and east, and from Central Asia. Truly, East met West in Xinjiang. European-descended nomads, Siberian and East Asian migrants, and native desert farmers all intermingled over the 1st and 2nd millennia BCE. This aligns with archaeological evidence like the Saka or Scythian influence seen in those Sebeshi graves, with nomadic-style weapons, horse gear, and clothing, and Han Chinese records mentioning contact with the Uizur and Wusun, which were Indo-European peoples in the Tarim region by the 1st millennium BCE. So during the Bronze Age, around 2100 to 1700, the people of the Tarim Basin, particularly those associated with the xiaohe culture, were found to have nearly 100% ancient North Eurasian ancestry. This population formed a unique genetic isolate with no recent admixture from neighboring groups, and they appear to be an indigenous lineage adopting farming and herding practices through cultural contact rather than the people of those cultures migrating in and interbreeding. To the north, in the Zongarian Basin, the Bronze Age population of around 3000 to 2800 BCE show predominantly Afanasyevo or Yamnaya steppe ancestry, with a minor local component. These were incoming Indo-European pastoralists who migrated into the region from the Siberian and Kazakh steppe, representing the early spread of Indo-European peoples into Inner Asia. By the Iron Age, around 1100 to 200 BCE, the Tarim Basin's oasis populations, including those sites at Yambulak and Sebeshi, at this time are displaying mixed ancestry. Their genetic profiles reflected varying proportions of West Eurasian Andronovo, or Scythian lineage, Central Asian BMAC, and East Asian components. And this all illustrates the region's transformation into a genetic and cultural crossroad. At first just influenced by cultural exchange, but then over thousands of years we do see genetic mixing, all along what would become a key position along the early Silk Road. But importantly, the genetics have clarified that the westernness of the early mummies was not due to a recent influx of Europeans, but actually to their very ancient shared ancestry. In fact, the Tarim group separated from other Eurasian populations well before the emergence of people that we call Celts, Aryans, or other historical groups. Yet they retain a look that to the 19th century eyes seemed European, because we were seeing the source of those features, not something that emerged in Europe and went out to the edge of China. They're from that far older Ice Age people that would later spread across Asia and into Europe. And their isolation also explains why early craniologists found them hard to classify. Also, the DNA evidence does not support the earlier idea that they were Proto-Tocharian speakers descended from the Afanasyevo. Instead, it now appears likely that the Tocharians, an Indo-European language, arrived in Xinjiang via the Afanasyevo-descended peoples in the north, around that site at Tsungaria, who later expanded or influenced areas to the south. Most likely, the Tarim mummies had their own languages, if they were some ANE isolate for so long, and only later did Indo-European speech, like Tocharian or Iranian Saka, eventually spread among these mixed populations of the oases. As linguistic professor Ronald Kim argues, the divergence among the two recorded Tocharian languages, Tocharian A and B, which are attested to in 500 to 700 AD in the Tarim Basin Buddhist texts, implies that their common ancestor of Proto-Tocharian must have been present by at least 1000 BCE in this region. This timing could fit the Andronovo-related nomads moving into the area during the Late Bronze Age, rather than the completely ANE Tarim founders. Now, the exotic allure of red-headed mummies in China's deserts also fueled many speculative theories. Early media reports often overstated the Caucasian appearance of the mummies, leading to claims that they were Celts, Vikings, or even lost tribes from Europe. But the most persistent rumor spoke of ancient pyramids in China built by Westerners, referencing the large earthen pyramid-shaped tomb mounds in other parts of China, or the towering grave structures in Xinjiang that were sometimes sensationalized as pyramids. In reality, the Tarim cemeteries were flat or marked by poles. The true pyramids of China are imperial mausoleums far to the east, like the 76-meter tomb mound for the first Qin emperor, which really does look like a stepped pyramid, but there's no evidence of these kind of stepped pyramids in the Tarim Basin. And it would be really superficial to think that there's an Egyptian influence here, just because there are mummies and pyramidal structures in China. Even these so-called Chinese pyramids are ancient mausoleums primarily located in the Shaanxi province, near the city of Xi'an. There are over 40 of these structures, and they were built as burial mounds for emperors and high-ranking nobles, particularly during the Qin and Han dynasties. Constructed mainly from rammed earth, these pyramidal mounds served as monument tombs. The mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang, this is the tomb of China's first emperor, famous for the terracotta army discovered nearby. The tomb itself remains unexcavated, but is known to be beneath a 76-meter-high mound shaped like a truncated pyramid. Historical texts describe an elaborate underground palace with rivers of mercury and a starry ceiling, though these accounts remain unverified due to the tomb's unexcavated state. And to be honest, I have no sympathy for academics that cry about conspiracy theorists when there are such astonishing roadblocks and just dead ends when it comes to this kind of research. Whether it's at Göbekli Tepe, the Giza Plateau, and honestly tons of different areas in Egypt, and over in China, it's just mind-boggling what hasn't been researched yet. And honestly, if academics get so annoyed at people claiming that there's some cover-up, I'd love for these studies to be carried out, and all of these theorists could be easily proven wrong. But the second site is the Maoling Mausoleum, the tomb of Emperor Wu of Han, and this is the largest of the Han Dynasty mausoleums. It gained attention in the West when, in 1947, U.S. pilot James Gossman reported seeing a massive white pyramid in the area, leading to speculation about a Great White Pyramid, but this was later identified as the Maoling Mausoleum. That use of rammed earth construction was both practical and symbolic, creating enduring monuments that have lasted for millennia. And while some of these sites, like the Terracotta Army, have become major tourist attractions, many of the pyramid tombs remain lesser known and are not widely promoted. So the so-called Chinese pyramids are significant archaeological and cultural landmarks that do show the ancient Chinese burial practices, their cosmology, and imperial ideology. And a lot of that was very similar to Egypt, not just at a superficial level in the fact that they are pyramidal and that there are mummies. This shows that they have a very similar worldview. Things can be constructed to link their special leader to the heavens, bridging Earth and the stars through these divine individuals, which has a lot in common with the pharaohs. Which means in some deep ways, the Chinese emperor and Egyptian pharaohs were viewed similarly. But if you watched my video on the shared culture flowing out of Anatolia of around 12 to 10,000 BC, a culture that was marked by preserving their ancestors' remains, important mound burial sites, and cattle worship, that we would later see taken to new levels and unique styles in the bull cults and iconography of Egypt and Sumerian cultures, with their pyramids and ziggurats. Well, just like how these Tarim Basin mummies have their genetic and other cultural aspects being so ancient that they were close to the source of many later divergent features, it could be that these were of this same deeply ancient culture, or were at least exposed to it so far back that they aren't inspired by Egyptians and Sumerians, but by that even more ancient shared cultural fountainhead. One popular misconception was that the Tarim mummies might represent a, quote, lost Caucasian tribe who brought civilization to early China. Many supremacist and Aryan-centric groups at the time seized upon the mummies as supposed proof of this ancient white presence in East Asia, and then it must have been these people who brought all of civilization to China. Mainstream scholars firmly reject these distortions, and as we've seen, the DNA evidence, which is the gold standard for an objective scientific measure, this shows that the Tarim people were indigenous Central Asians, not some invading or colonizing force from Europe. It's just that they share ancient roots with European populations via the ANE ancestry, and they were separated by tens of millennia. Their technology and culture, the textiles, wagons, etc., likely came through gradual diffusion across Eurasia, not a one-time civilizing mission from west to east. Like how the bronze metallurgy appears to have arisen locally, or been learned from multiple neighboring cultures, rather than being imported wholesale by outsiders. Chinese archaeologists found that bronze working developed in Xinjiang concurrently with, or slightly after its development in the central plains of China. So it's not a simple case of West teaching East. And there also seems to be cattle domestication in eastern China at least around the same time. In that other video I mentioned before, I'm focusing on how the Anatolian domestications directly influenced Egypt and Sumer, and that the Zebu cattle is developed later around India, but there's evidence of a far-off separate cattle domestication event, at least around the same time, if not slightly older than the Taurine cattle developed in Anatolia. So the developments in Anatolia are what directly influenced the Mediterranean and Near East and Egypt, but about as far east as you can get in Asia, there is a third, separate, and maybe even slightly older version of domesticated cattle in China. Just going to that point that there have been these different breakthroughs in technology in different areas without them being directly influenced by other areas. There are independent breakthroughs in things like domestication or metallurgy. Now, saying all that, it is funny, but I do want to point out that this is not derived from some weird racism or to be in wonder of the Caucasians. Like I said, the DNA evidence debunked a lot of those older theories, but still with the most updated version of the story on these red-haired mummies, a lot of that tech is still coming from the Caucasians in the literal sense of this area around the Caucasus Mountains. Obviously, the H-man made it so academics are too scared to ever say that, but so many technological advancements originate from the Black Sea and Caspian Sea regions, and these all would spread outward to the Fertile Crescent and over to Asia, including to the people of the Tarim Basin. So not in the modern sense of them being whites as in Northern Europeans, which, if we're being honest, when this is being thrown around, usually it just means England, France, and Germany for times, while ironically seeing this whole region that is actually closer to the Caucasus as somehow being not white, at least not in any way that was convenient for the brand of racism they were trying to push, but that doesn't mean that we should lie either. Everything from the domestication of dogs, horses, cattle, goats, wheat, and other plants, textile innovations, the wheel, and chariots, all originate from this Central Asia Caucasus region, and then spread out, even into China, where it would mingle and be influenced by local Chinese innovations as well. I'm not saying everything came from this Caucasus region, but I also think this is often downplayed and ignored. And all that tech gets picked up by many different cultures, which importantly, as we see with the Tarim Basin mummies, it didn't mean that they interbred with these people. They all still had very different genetic makeups, from Egypt to eastern China and Denmark. All of these areas were perpetuating their cultures in their own new ways, without much genetic mixing from the people from the Caucasus. They just picked up some of this tech, innovated it further, or had cultural and artistic ways to express it in new and interesting ways, developing their own art and technologies. Across history, many populations have undergone sweeping cultural transformations, adopting new religions, languages, and political systems, while remaining genetically and physically much the same. Three of the clearest examples of this are in Turkey, Iran, and Egypt, where modern populations continue to resemble their ancient ancestors far more than their cultural labels might suggest. In Turkey, the arrival of Turkic-speaking nomads from Central Asia in the 11th century led to the widespread adoption of the Turkish language and Islam. But modern genetic studies show that the people of Anatolia today are overwhelmingly descended from the region's pre-Turkic inhabitants, like Byzantines, Greeks, Armenians, and even earlier populations like the Hittites and Phrygians. Central Asian Turkic ancestry makes up only a small fraction, estimated at 5 to 15% at most, and I've even seen that DNA tests are banned in this area because of this. So despite the deep cultural and linguistic change, most Turkish people retain the Mediterranean and West Asian physical features of their Anatolian ancestors from 2 to 4 to 6,000 years ago. As one major study put it, quote, "The Turkish language was imposed on a largely local population, whose ancestry predates the arrival of the Turks by millennia." It's a similar story in Iran, with the Arab-Muslim conquest of the 7th century CE. The Persian Empire was absorbed into the Islamic world, Arabic became the language of religion and science, and Iran adopted Islamic customs and script. Yet the people remained ethnically and genetically continuous with the Indo-European speaking Persians, Medes, and other Iranian groups that had lived there for thousands of years. Even today, Persian, or Farsi, remains an Indo-European language, completely separate from Arabic, and many Iranians exhibit the same facial structure, skin tones, and tall, sharp-featured physiognomy, lighter eyes and hair color, all which classical writers used to describe ancient Persians. The genetic records also confirm this, showing strong continuity between ancient and modern Iranians, with only limited gene flow from the Arabian Peninsula or other invading groups. In Egypt, the Arab conquests also brought cultural and religious transformation. Egyptian society became Islamic, it took on the Arabic language, and was now governed by the Caliphate. But just like in Turkey and Iran, the people themselves did not change nearly as much. Genetic studies comparing ancient Egyptian mummies to modern populations show that modern Egyptians are still closely related to their ancient ancestors. While some Arabian and sub-Saharan admixture occurred over centuries, especially in the Nile Delta and along trade routes, the core population remained rooted in the Nile Valley, continuous from pharaonic times through to today. Physically, many Egyptians today still carry the facial features, hair textures, and skin tones seen in ancient tomb paintings and sculptures. Despite the adoption of this Arab identity in Islamic culture, the biological ancestry of the Egyptian people is predominantly local. And so what happened in the Tarim Basin 4,000 years ago is the same story. They took on a lot of aspects from foreign cultures, but remained mostly genetically unmixed. So somewhat like how Arabic spread to these other areas that did not genetically mix with Arabs, some of these Tarim people could have eventually adopted the Tocharian tongue as these cultures merged, but we have no written records from their time to know for sure. The attested Tocharians of the first millennia AD, living in city-states like Kucha and Turpan, likely had a mixed heritage, primarily derived from those later Iron Age migrants, with some genetic inheritance from the Bronze Age Tarim populace. And so just to be clear, that 2021 DNA study concluded, quote, "Our results do not support previous hypotheses of this simple steppe or BMAC origins. Instead, the Tarim Basin culture, quote, appears to have origin from a genetically isolated local population that adopted neighboring pastoralist and agriculturalist practices. In short, the Tarim people prove that innovation travels across ethnic lines. One can have Western-looking mummies practicing Eastern-style agriculture, like millet farming, or Asian-looking mummies buried with the Western-style plaid cloth. They show that this area was always a contact point where things were being traded from east to west, long before this became known as the Silk Road. Now, if you're just here for the ancient history, please hit that like button. I'm about done with that, but I do want to cover the modern political side to this, because from the start, the Tarim mummies have been embroiled in questions far beyond archaeology, touching from ethnic identity, nationalism, and political sensitivities in China. The mummies were found in what is today the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, home to the Uyghur people, a Turkic-speaking, predominantly Muslim ethnic group distinct from China's Han majority. The Uyghurs have a long history in this region. Their medieval kingdom in the Tarim area was established after 842 AD, but they are not direct descendants of the Bronze Age Tarim peoples. Nonetheless, when the Lulan Beauty was discovered in the late 1970s, some local Uyghur activists claimed her as an ancestor, seeing in her ancient presence a justification for Uyghurs' primacy in this region. Propagating the idea that Caucasian mummies equals early Uyghurs could bolster their argument that Xinjiang, which some Uyghurs call East Turkestan, was never originally Chinese. These claims, of course, alarmed Chinese authorities, who have long struggled with Uyghur separatist sentiment, and last I heard, they were carrying out a genocide to try and remove them, just in case you're worried this channel was funded by good old Chairman Poo. Beijing's government, weary of any narrative that challenged China's territorial unity, they reacted by exerting tight control over research and discourse on the mummies. For years, foreign scientists found it difficult to get DNA samples or publish findings, as permission was often denied. Quote, "In terms of advanced scientific research on the mummies, it's just not happening," complained Victor Mayer in 2008, frustrated by the slow pace caused by political caution. Indeed, Chinese officials were concerned that DNA evidence of Western origins might be spun into separatist propaganda. And this sensitivity came to a head in 2010 to 2011 when an American museum exhibition titled Secrets of the Silk Road was set to feature several Tarim mummies on tour. After showing in California and Texas, the artifacts were supposed to go to the University of Pennsylvania Museum. But just before the Philadelphia opening, the Chinese government abruptly withdrew the mummies and artifacts, a move that baffled and upset the museum and researchers. Officially, Chinese authorities cited regulations limiting overseas exhibits to under a year, claiming the mummies were out for too long. Observers suspected the real reason was political. High-level bureaucrats feared that displaying these mummies, with their Caucasian features being highlighted in a Western museum, might ignite unwanted commentary on Xinjiang's original inhabitants. Only after intense diplomatic negotiations, reportedly involving US and Chinese ambassadors, were the mummies allowed to be briefly shown in Philadelphia. But even then, they were whisked back to China by March 2011, months earlier than planned. National Geographic noted that visitors were astonished by the mummies' quote, non-Chinese appearance, which hinted at a more complex history of ethnic interactions across the Silk Road than previously understood. And it's this exact complex, multi-ethnic history that made some Chinese officials uneasy. Within China, the government has tried to integrate the Tarim mummies' story into the narrative of a unified, multicultural Chinese nation. In recent years, Chinese scientists have taken lead roles in the research, and they emphasize that Xinjiang has always been seen as a mixing of peoples. A 2022 Chinese study published in Science analyzed 201 ancient genomes from Xinjiang, of that Bronze Age to historic era, and that's how we get that 2022 study published in Science, where they analyzed 201 of those ancient genomes from Xinjiang, showing that it was a melting pot of at least 4 ancestries. And Chinese media presented this as evidence that modern Xinjiang residents, the Uyghurs and others, descended from multiple origins, implying that no simple group can claim to be the first people there. These debates really show how even 4,000-year-old skeletons can become political symbols in modern ethnic conflicts. And it's true that even if your people have been there for 1,200 years, it doesn't mean they grew out of the soil and that they'd been there forever. The only group that could really claim it are those ANE ancestors, and those have all but been diffused into other groups. From a global perspective, the Tarim mummies have reshaped our understanding of early cultural exchange. They remind us that the Silk Road has prehistoric precursors. Long before Chinese silk or Roman traders, there were humble Bronze Age communities in Central Asia experimenting with cultural fusion. As Christina Warrener, one of the lead geneticists, observed, The Tarim people adopted crops, livestock, and even fashion from every direction. West Asian wheat and dairy, East Asian millet, Caucasian textiles, steppe felt hats. Yet even with interaction with all these foreign cultures, they remain genetically distinct for centuries. A testament to how geography, with the towering Tian Shan and Kunlun mountains, could isolate a pocket of people even as ideas filtered through. Their eventual mingling with new migrants set stage for the vibrant Silk Road civilizations that would later flourish in these same oases, from the Tocharian Buddhist kingdoms that left behind ornate cave art and manuscripts, to the Sogdian and Turkic merchants who settled here during the medieval period. In the end, the red-haired mummies of China are significant not because they show Europeans in ancient China, a simplification that is both politicized and inaccurate, but because it demonstrates the deep antiquity of East-West contacts and the complexity of human migrations. They show that people at the fringes of the ancient Chinese world were far more diverse and connected than once thought. And this challenges older, China-centric views of history, revealing Xinjiang not as a peripheral backwater, but a crucible of different cultures, where Western Eurasian and Eastern Eurasian strands intertwined, while being distinct for so long that they still have that ancient North Eurasian connection, showing that a people could be genetically the same for thousands of years, even as they took on foreign cultures. And it should remind everyone that just because you see aspects of one culture spread far across the globe, it doesn't mean that seeing that tech means that you are seeing a civilization built by the same people that originally invented that technology. All sorts of technology and cultural elements can flow into foreign lands, while the indigenous people remain genetically the same.